Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seminar on Brexit, organised by the Progressive Economy Forum. My name is Patrick Allen, the chair of the forum. PEF is an independent economics think tank dedicated to devising economic policy to rebuild the UK economy to achieve a stable and sustainable prosperity, eliminating poverty and inequality. Our activities are driven by an active council of 20 senior economists and other academics. And we have a practical mission, which is to help progressive political parties achieve credible economic policy and thereby assist them into government to implement it. And we wish to play a role in helping all to a greater understanding of economics, of what works and what does not work. Austerity and Brexit are prime examples of the wrong policy. We've called this debate for two reasons: the enormous damage to the economy caused by Brexit, which is reported on daily, and the apparent silence of the main economists to talk about it. So as to the damage, hardly a day seems to go by without the baleful consequences of another Brexit headache being revealed. We have shortages of materials and finished products and food and petrol and of labour in most sectors of the economy. Yesterday, we read that many restaurants had to close 25% of the time for lack of staff. And this is because we cut ourselves off from the enormous EU single market of labour overnight without any planning. There are sausage wars and fish wars and dangers to peace in Northern Ireland because the protocol is being called into question only months after we signed it. Post-Brexit deals with the rest of the world are laughably small and do not make up for the losses caused by leaving the EU. Those losses are apparently 178 times bigger than the gains from new trade deals so far, according to research by the UK Trade Policy Observatory. The big parties are resolutely not talking about this or working on a plan to solve the problems. The government only talks in boosterish terms about Brexit, which hardly got a mention in the budget speech, except something about tax breaks for ships flying the red ensign. And Labour seems to be too concerned about red wall votes to offer much criticism. We need a debate and an analysis of what's gone wrong and a route plan to fix it. It may mean a better and closer relationship with the EU, possible re-entry to the single market, and who knows, rejoining the EU one day if that's the only way to correct this historic error. The biggest own goal in our peacetime history, says Gordon Brown. So the title is Brexit. Where are we now and where do we go from here? We have four very distinguished speakers, all with a particular knowledge of Brexit, and our chair is Johnna Montgomerie, Professor of International Political Economy at King's College London and a member of the Council of PEF. So over to you, Johnna.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and welcome everybody to this seminar. As we all know, Brexit has turned out to be a very protracted political event. What started with a referendum result in June 2016 and supposedly ended on December 31st with the exit of the UK from Europe, the effects of which are still continue. While many have opinions of the good, bad, and ugly about Brexit, what is undoubted is that we are living through a great moment of change and transformation. It is clear that Brexit is very political. And it has very strong economic effects. The politics of Brexit can be seen in the rhetoric of sovereignty and take back control, but also in the electoral polls. The economic effects of Brexit are clearly multiple. There are technical trade issues. There are macroeconomic output issues, but there are personal issues like employment, standard of living, as well as the overall well-being of the nation. While few can agree necessarily on what exactly is to come, it's very clear that many believe Brexit is connected to important conjunctural drivers, such as economic stagnation since 2008 in particular, but also concerns about growing political polarization, whether that's between the left and right in the growing culture wars, or whether it's about Europe itself and the growing pressures of European disintegration. Today's event is not about explaining why or how Brexit occurred. As we've said, we're living through this great period of transformation and unfolding. We're here today to discuss where we are now in the midst of this unfolding and look to the future to ask where we go from here. And to explore these questions, we have such a distinguished panel of guests who will look at it from all kinds of, who will look at these questions from all kinds of angles. First, we have Professor Chris Gray from Royal Holloway, who is the author of the Brexit blog, which has been put into a new monograph, Brexit Unfolded, which of course, as you can see, I draw on this metaphor very strongly. But also, next up, we have Professor Peter Holmes, who is from Sussex, very distinguished UK Trade Observatory, to talk about the trade angle, as well as two distinguished experts from the civil service, or who have long periods in the civil service and are now with the, King's College's UK and a Changing Europe, Jill Rutter and Jonathan Portis, who will come in and discuss various elements of the effects of Brexit, of where we are and where we're going. For those of you at home, all you'll see of me is just reminding our speakers of their time to conclude, but please do bring in your questions into the chat. I'll be collecting them and presenting them at the end to our speakers. So that's enough from me. Let's get on with this very interesting and provocative discussion. Let me turn it over to you, Professor Gray.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that welcome, and thanks for the event. If I could just ask for my first slide to be put up, please. So Brexit Unfolded is the book that Johanna just mentioned, and I'm going to just talk this evening about some ideas of the way that Brexit is still unfolding. So if we could have the next slide. That's just some nice things that people have said about the book, but I don't want anyone to think it's entirely plain sailing, because if you look at the bottom right-hand screen, you can see a nice review on Amazon, which it does recommend that people read it, but by all means read it and laugh. The authors, I can't quite say what it says. The author's erroneous assumptions are quite amusing, but don't take it seriously. That's the job for bitter, hardcore bitter Remainers. Actually, if you read the book, you'd find that there were quite a lot of things that would be extremely irritating to hardcore bitter Remainers. But anyhow, what I want to do this evening is to take these, take 4 lines from that book. To think about the issue of how Brexit is still unfolding. So one line of thought goes to the line that I wrote in the book about the end of the transition period, which is where the book ends. The book tells the story from the day after the referendum through to the end of the transition period. But I say the end of the transition period was not an end; it was the beginning of a new phase in the unfolding Brexit process. And so indeed, clearly that's proved to be the case. Secondly, the thought that the situation in Northern Ireland was set up in such a way as to make future problems and disputes inevitable. I think that's quite a strong word. I'm not very fond in in all kinds of contexts, but certainly in the Brexit context, I'm not very fond of the notion of inevitability, but I think there was an inevitability in that particular case. The thought that whenever any kind of Brexit was actually defined, that for some or other parts of the sort of Brexit, if you like, community, that some of them would consider it to be a betrayal of true Brexit. And the final thought, the inescapable fact of the linkage between the UK and the rest of the continent by reason of geography, history, and economy. So I'll just whiz through those thoughts very quickly. And so if we could have the next slide. So on the first one of those, well, just the fact that it was really only, you could see lots of economic effects before, but it was really after the end of the transition that you began to see quite clearly economic effects in terms of immediately kind of, sort of images of fish unsold and so on, so quite visibly in a way that perhaps hadn't been the case before, and issues of trade suppression, supply and labour crisis. And that's been alluded to by Patrick, but I think that both Peter and I guess Jonathan will say more perhaps about those kinds of things. And just the fact, which is still the case, that there are key parts of the implementation of what was agreed, which have been staggered or postponed or are still sort of ongoing. And I guess most importantly there, perhaps, the fact that the UK import controls weren't introduced immediately, and in fact have been postponed, I think, 3 times now, and aren't due to come into place until the beginning of next year. And also on the other side, the issue about certification of UK exports to the EU and certification of their origin, and that will be really important and big moment for a lot of UK businesses to have to comply with that, the various grace periods and so on, all kinds of things which didn't happen immediately, and to some extent, to an extent by design, didn't happen immediately, and which are therefore still ongoing, and all kinds of things which are sort of have both happened and not happened, you know. So we got the EU granting of data adequacy, but that is something which could be taken away from the UK at some point in the future, or things like membership of Lugano Convention, which has so far been turned down for the UK, which wants to join, but potentially that could go the other way. So the whole process is set up to be an ongoing one. For years. So then the next kind of set of thoughts is to do with Northern Ireland. So if we could have the next slide. Now, I mean, it seems, I think at the time, but certainly it now seems even clearer that the government really didn't accept the kind of the core provision of the Irish sea border, and certainly many of the most enthusiastic Brexiters didn't, and didn't perhaps even intend to honour what was agreed, and that grows itself out of a long kind of pre-history about I would say sort of bad faith in terms of the negotiation of the Northern Ireland arrangements going right back to 2017, and we can see in many respects the kind of UK demands hardening, particularly most recently in relation to the idea that any ECJ involvement within Northern Ireland is unacceptable, and that really only emerged as an idea in July. So we can see those kind of hardening demands. The outcome of all this clearly remains unclear, and anyone following the process, you know, knows that we keep hearing one thing, sort of first harder and then softer kind of statements, and the discussions about that are ongoing. And then my third line of thought, so if I could have the next slide, is this idea about sort of betrayal. And I think it's a really important and intriguing part of the kind of political psychology of the Brexit story, that for some, any kind of Brexit would be a betrayal, and that's partly because of of unrealistic ideas of what Brexit could be. But I think it's also partly that for some of them, there's almost a certain kind of psychological desire to be betrayed in order to demonstrate that, you know, because if you are the downtrodden victims of the elite and the establishment, what happens to you when you win? And potentially the only place to go with that psychology is to say, oh, well, we won, but what we've been given isn't what we were promised. And certainly for a lot of what I call in the book the kind of Brexit ultras, so the kind of ERG type people, have never regarded the entirety of the withdrawal agreement as being what they call sovereignty compliant. And for those people, Brexit could never be done and will never be done. And it entails a perpetual conflict, both externally with the EU and internally with kind of Remainers. And I think it was actually 3 days, the trade and cooperation agreement was announced, the deal had been done, was announced on Christmas Eve. And I think it was 3 days from then before the first headline appeared in the Daily Express saying Brexit has been betrayed. And so that betrayal narrative continues to be part of the ongoing narrative. And then finally, if I could have the next slide, looking forward, you know, it seems inescapable. You know, one of the things the Brexiters often said is we're leaving the EU, we're not leaving Europe. Well, that was a kind of truism, and in a certain way, a rather kind of banal thing to say. But as a truism, it is also true. The leave or remain question, you know, is now a dead one. But the question of the ongoing relationship is very much a live one. And I think that to engage in that seriously, firstly, there's this almost kind of conspiracy of silence that has grown up with the Conservatives not really wanting to talk about talk about it very much, and Labour certainly not wanting to go near it. And I think possibly Jill Rutter is going to say more about that kind of thing. But you know, you can't just sort of ignore such a kind of major change in both economics and kind of geopolitical strategy and just sort of pretend, well, it was just some kind of embarrassing event that happened at the Christmas party, but it's better not to mention it. And so there needs, you know, I think, to be more sort of realism and honesty about that. I can't see that the rational or strategic logic of the situation has to be one of economic harmonization and political harmony. Of course, it doesn't follow that because that's a rational strategy that it's what will happen. But it's what needs to happen, and for it to happen, there needs to be a series of and there are potentially some kind of gradual and pragmatic steps towards doing that. And again, I think other speakers will talk about that. But within that context, I don't think either this kind of perpetual hostility from the Brexit ultras or the kind of campaign to rejoin, neither of those things is really helpful, because effectively they're still stuck in the dead question: should we stay or should we leave? Well, we left, so it's a dead question. And what needs instead to be a sort of de-Brexitification of this, so that we normalize relations, but that's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in a few months or even a few years. I mean, I think it's almost something for the next political, or that will take us through to the next political generation. So it's still unfolding. And if you want to chart, it's still unfolding. If we just have the next final slide. And if you want to keep on top of it, it's unfolding, then you can read my Brexit and Beyond blog that appears every Friday morning at about 8:30, that analyses the week's news and the and comments on them. So that's my thoughts, and I think I've used my 12 minutes to the exact second.
Thank you so much. So I just want to flag that we've had a bit of a technical difficulty in that the Eventbrite that everybody signed up to is down, so people aren't able to get the Zoom link. So we've just sent it out, and I've seen the numbers jump, I think by 6 people in just the 2 minutes since we tweeted it out. So my apologies if it means that now the audience is sort of coming in at the end, but of course we do have a recording of that first session. So anybody that was here that do have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll collect them there for Professor Gray at the end. And then hopefully that allows everybody to come in from now that the information is being sent out. So next we'll move on then to our next guest, which is Professor Peter Holmes from Sussex's UK Trade Observatory, which is a partnership with Chatham House, a long-standing expert on trade, which I think was for a long time considered just a technical matter and now is becoming highly politicized. We're very lucky to have Professor Holmes here to discuss Brexit with us, so we'll turn it over to you.
Could I have the first slide, if you don't mind? I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm not at all surprised to find myself in total agreement with what Chris Gray said, but I was actually rather startled that my first comment was going to be that I am now in agreement with Shankar Singham, who was on the giving evidence to the International Trade Committee with 2 key members of Trade Twitter, who I would recommend to everybody if you're interested in trade policy, David Hennig and Emily Rees. And Shankar Singham said, oh, well, this isn't, the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, was just the beginning. We've got lots more negotiation to do. And he seemed to be actually advocating closer cooperation with the EU, which is a nice line for him to be taking. I think it's important. I mean, the theme that I want to stress is quite similar to what Chris is saying, namely that although it might be true to say Brexit is done, it is in fact not complete. It is a process of permanent negotiation, and if you look through successive drafts of the TCA, particularly the British versions, you can see time after time, the British were asking for things which they knew would actually be highly desirable to facilitate the flow of trade despite Brexit. And the EU was constantly saying, sorry, no, not unless you agree to closer alignment. But and so the TCA, as Shankar Singham was saying this morning, is in fact an extremely empty, a shallow document, but in fact it contains lots of gateways, some of which are built in and some of which are optional. And perhaps I can have the second slide. The I think in some sense, I'd like to sort of address the concerns of the Labour Party here. Should we reopen the trade and cooperation agreement, or should we just pretend that it's something we shouldn't talk about? But in fact, the TCA, the treaty, contains a review clause, unlike the Rome Treaty, which was technically not permanent, but as we've just seen, a treaty of indefinite duration, meaning it could be ended at some point. Until it was ended, it didn't end. The Trade Cooperation Agreement is a 5-year treaty, and every 5 years it needs renewal. And what I find quite extraordinary is that there's no, as Chris was saying, there's no discussion of this. We ought to be saying, what do we want? What do we want to do in 5 years, after 5 years, which is now not very far away, not if we're going to have a discussion about it. In particular, there are provisions on trade which automatically come up for review even before the 5-year deadline. So I think there's need for a discussion. Okay, we got this kind of very hard Brexit. Is it good for the UK? Is this the best arrangement we could have had? Or would we have done better? It's not really would we have done better. The point I want to make is, could we do better in the present circumstances by, it's not renegotiating, it's not throwing it away, but saying, using the provisions in the existing agreement to improve our position. So there is the overall review in 2025, but there are a series of other very, very specific things which the British government, well, is obviously, I think Jill Rutter will explain this, is hand to mouth, day to day. But for people who want to take a more strategic view, what are the things that we should be thinking about as these built-in deadlines come up? So, for example, the treaty specified that, and I'm trying to stick to the trade dimensions, but trade and regulations are the same thing these days. Trade policy is not about tariffs, it's about regulations. One of the most interesting and important areas in the light of the COP thing is the EU proposal for what are now called carbon border adjustments. When I was a lad writing about this stuff 10 years ago, they were called border carbon adjustments, not carbon border adjustments, but we move on. And there is a provision in the treaty which says it will be decided, the UK has an option to decide how closely it wants to align its emissions control system with that of the EU. And that will have some effect on the trade relationship. Well, we now know that it will have a very significant effect, because if the UK doesn't align its ETS, emissions trading system, or if we move to a carbon tax, if we don't move to something like the EU has got, we will find ourselves liable to the carbon border adjustments, the tax surcharges, which the EU and in their recent deal together, the EU and the US are planning to put on countries which don't have carbon policies which are roughly in alignment. So this is something which is built into the treaty. We have to decide, and if we don't decide to, in some sense, align with the EU, which would mean having a roughly at least equivalent carbon tax, we will find ourselves potentially subject to quite serious additional tariffs on the part of the EU. There are all kinds of much more minor things, but there's something called the duty drawback provision in the trade part of the treaty, which is about what happens to goods which have been imported into one partner and then sent on to the other, but have benefited from a tariff reduction from third countries. So if steel comes in from China and is allowed in duty free, what happens to the duties paid on anything made out of that steel, which then is going into the EU. Now, this actually has serious implications for the so-called free ports, which I'm trying to avoid talking about since I seem to talk about it an awful lot. If anybody wants to ask a question about free ports, I'd be very happy to say something about it. But the point is that the treaty calls for renegotiations of the duty drawback arrangements between the EU and the US in 2023. There is a set of negotiations built in on fish quotas. Title 10 of the treaty talks about regulatory cooperation, something which is left very vague, but it needs to be discussed. What are we going to do about this? I'm going to say something in the final slide about standards as such. So there's the periodic votes on the Northern Ireland Protocol, a series of decisions which we have to take. We can't just say, oh, let's shove our head under the duvet and not discuss them. These have to be discussed because there are things that are going to be done. But there are, in addition, a whole series of opportunities which we don't have to discuss, but could. The EU has made it clear that if the UK wanted to open up discussions on regulatory alignment of SPS, food safety standards, we could do this and get a huge reduction in the amount of border controls on foodstuffs. The Partnership Council is a functioning body which can discuss elements of cooperation. So we have institutional arrangements which the government didn't want to have, but are in the TCA and can be used for addressing these problems, any problems. So perhaps I could have the final one. So the question is, how should we use these opportunities that the flexibility built into the TCA? You don't have to say we're going to throw it all away, but how are we going to use these opportunities? Well, one of the few achievements that the government got in the TCA agreement was actually that the EU abandoned its insistence of no cherry picking. If you go through the EU on the trade side, you'll see a whole series of very specific things. In the car sector, actually, we were able to promise regulatory alignment, or at least as long as we have regulatory alignment on cars, we don't have to, our so-called conformity assessment documentation is accepted by the EU. So something in pharmaceuticals, which is a bit more complicated, and something else in aerospace. So the point is, we have a series of issues where the government really decided it wasn't sensible to have complete regulatory non-alignment, and the consequential huge non-tariff barriers would arise. But there are a whole series of other things where we could change our rather stupid ideas about not accepting the EU's REACH directive on chemicals, which if we don't accept it, it means we can't export chemicals to third countries. That's a unilateral thing, but we do need to think about that. I think and a very important thing is that not long ago, the UK agreed to retain membership of the EU, not EU, European standards bodies, CEN and Senelec, in which actually the UK has signed up to accept majority voting on standards. Now, standards aren't regulations. That's different from testing and certification, accreditation, but standards are an important area. And we actually are members of the European standard bodies. We have a voice, and we also have an obligation to accept European standards. So the question is, are we going to pretend that this isn't an issue for us, and then say, oh, we didn't mean to do a Northern Ireland Protocol, say, oh, we didn't really mean to join SEN, or are we going to take a constructive role in one of the few areas where we actually do have a voice in designing European regulatory regimes? So mutual recognition agreements, which apparently Shanker-Singham wants, how well has it worked out to have this freedom of maneuver? What can we what opportunities should we use in regulatory alignment to minimize trade frictions? So what I was saying is there are a whole load of things which don't involve the Labour Party saying, oh, we should never have signed the TCA, we're going back on our acceptance of it. We probably shouldn't have signed it, and it's not clear that Labour was right to vote for it, but still, Labour can say, okay, we voted for it, we're now going to use it to promote closer cooperation and kind of address the issue, which I think Chris and other people have said, the TCA, to some extent, is an unstable equilibrium. It could be used by the hardliners to say, end of 5 years, let's go to so-called WTO rules, or can we use it to move ourselves closer, have more cooperation? Doesn't mean to say we're going to, that doesn't mean rejoining, but it might conceivably one day mean that gets back on the agenda. So thank you very much indeed. And I think I've overrun slightly, but I'll stop now. Thanks.
No, not at all. Not at all. Perfect timing. Very, very well done. So I can see, again, we've had another sort of influx of, sorry for shaking my computer, an influx of participants. Again, for those of you who just joined me, all I can do is apologize that the Eventbrite was down at the moment. We needed you to click on your Zoom links. But hopefully everybody who wanted to be here is here now. And of course, the speakers are recorded if you want to catch up later. But if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. And I'm collecting them at the end. Okay, so yes, next we move on then to our two speakers from the UK and a Changing Europe. And we'll start with Jill Rutter. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Johnna, and thank you, everybody. It might seem a bit weird, but I'm going to start by saying that neither of the organisations I work with, either UK and a Changing Europe nor the Institute for Government, have a view on Brexit as a good or bad thing. So Patrick obviously has very strong views on that. I am much more neutral. But what we do believe in both organisations is that debate should take place on the basis of facts and evidence. So what I'm going to talk about, if you like, is the sort of complementary side to what Peter was talking about, which is what's going on domestically. Because after all, if we look, I don't have slides, everybody will have slides, but I'm not showing them to you because they're just words. So other people have gone on about where we are on the UK-EU relationship, but you know, Brexit, and particularly the sort of Brexit that Lord Frost and Boris Johnson wanted, was determined by their desire to reclaim regulatory autonomy. That was the big theme, and that is, after all, why we have the sort of very thin deal that Peter was setting out in the discussion there. So what do we do? Remember those big mantras of taking back control. Agreement on fish, taking back control of our waters. Of course, there's a bit of a long transition and we will lose a lot of our access if we did actually take full control of our waters and exclude the Northern European states from them in 4.5, 5 years' time. But in principle, we can do that. The government refused to countenance freedom of movement or indeed negotiate an extensive mobility agreement. That's led to some of the problems that we've seen for people wanting to do business in the EU, something that arguably we haven't really seen red in tooth and claw yet because of COVID. We're not making any sort of general budget contribution. Remember, taking back control of our money once, of course, we paid down that financial settlement and the money is flowing out. I think we probably paid out the overwhelming lion's share by the end of next year. So the big driver, both of the Northern Ireland Protocol, remember Northern Ireland, in a sense, was the price to pay for regulatory autonomy in Great Britain, and the Trade and Cooperation were the desire to take back control of our laws. So the really interesting question is, what are we doing with that, since we actually decided that that was why we would go for a very distant relationship with our largest trading partner, despite many eminent economists arguing that we should go the other way? Well, one thing that was very clear, and I think this was very clear from Theresa May's interpretation of Brexit very early on, was that we had to end freedom of movement. David Cameron had failed to get satisfaction in the renegotiation, any sort of form of break. And now we have a new migration regime. I'm not going to talk very much about that because, unless I'm very much mistaken, Jonathan Portes will talk about that because he knows loads more about it than me. we're finally shaking off the shackles of the common agricultural policy, which I could add the words before that, much hated common agricultural policy. Not many EU policies where I think you would find a lot of Remainers saying actually the UK should be able to do it better, but I think agriculture may be one. A lot of environmentalists are quite concerned about the effects of the CAP over the years. If you look at the index of farmland birds plummeting, except it was plummeting before we joined, but certainly not helped by CAP regimes, been through various reforms, not the cap of wine lakes, etc., but we're still moving. And the UK government for England is certainly planning a very radical reform unleashed first by Michael Gove. We don't know what it'll actually look like when it finally comes in on a long transition from 2024, but it's quite radical to move from payment for ownership of land to payment for public goods. We've just had the government's mega piece of environmental legislation passed, the new Environment Act, which sets up a new environment oversight regime to replace the enforcement powers of the Commission, European Court of Justice, new Office for Environmental Protection. Government is also committed to set long-term environmental targets. And the UK has a new state subsidy regime, but subject to some constraints in both the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So we've seen quite a lot of policy change. But elsewhere, frankly, so far, it's a bit thin gruel, despite much talk about these new regulatory opportunities. So where do we look for them? Well, Peter mentioned free ports. I'll mention free ports. Much trumpeted, everybody else then points out we could do free ports when we were in the EU. Maybe we can do more with those free ports, but one of the things that there does seem to be an economic consensus on is that free ports are much better at relocating economic activity, that may after all be your objective, than in increasing it overall. We've seen some tax changes from the Chancellor, to which I think the word trivial and maybe slightly misguided might best be applied. But yeah, the Chancellor was right that certainly for Great Britain, he can now reform alcohol duties onto a more logical basis than he could have done when we were subject to the EU's excise duty regimes. Other things probably don't stop the traffic in those words. There's some regulatory changes the government's already consulting on. We've seen proposed bans on live animal exports. Remember, the Conservative Manifesto said we wanted to be free of EU constraints in order to raise standards, not to diminish them. A consultation on gene editing, possible moves on genetic modification down the line. Quite controversial there. But actually, one of the biggest forms of divergence, because what this is about is diverging from the EU, is where the EU is putting through lots of legislation and the UK is not following it, either because it doesn't want to. It's looked at that EU legislation. If it's to goods, it has to implement it in Northern Ireland, but if it's not, it doesn't have to. But doesn't have to implement it for the rest of the UK. So there are areas where it's not. And partly that's because actually it's much less easy for us to legislate than it was when we were EU members. Then we had a very easy way of transposing EU directives through the European Communities Act. We've lost that legislative facility. But there are other moves. I mean, we saw the Chancellor, I think last year, the UK was trying to get a decision on financial equivalence, indeed sent billions and billions of pages over to Brussels to try and get the EU to make equivalence decisions for UK financial services. But I think, notwithstanding the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Chancellor has now pretty much given up the ghost on financial services. He's trying to do some deal with Switzerland, and he's trying to make the UK a much more attractive destination for global capital, particularly to give it a sort of advantage in fintech and green finance as markets of the future. And actually that looking forward to saying where actually can the UK try to be a pace setter in the future regulatory regime is an area that was identified in the well-named Tigger report, the report by Ian Duncan Smith, Teresa Villiers, and George Freeman, published in the summer, which was trying to identify where the regulatory opportunities were. They said, focus on the future, look at areas where the UK can establish leadership. The theory of change there is then, it's interesting, Peter mentioned some of the sort of standards bodies, is that the UK then becomes, if you like, you know, the way California used to lead and set standards in the US, that the UK replaces the Brussels effect with a bit of a London effect. So that might be that might be quite an interesting space to watch. Interestingly, what the Tigger report did was say, don't particularly focus on the back catalogue of EU legislation. Of course, that's where the fears are, not least because Lord Frost has promised a streamlined mechanism to allow modifications to what is called, in the techie sense, retained EU law. So that's that big rule book that we inherited and we cut and paste into UK law when we changed it over. So watch that space. We don't know what that looks like, but things to watch out. But actually, the regulatory freedom that the UK has is not as all-embracing as I've just suggested. In theory, we have taken back control, but in practice, we face quite a lot of constraints. The Northern Ireland Protocol, any area where we diverge on a rule that applies in Northern Ireland, but not in the rest of the UK, risks deepening that pesky sea border, which is implicit in the Northern Ireland Protocol. There are potential for rows with the devolves. Both the Scottish and Welsh government have said they will try and follow EU rule changes. Scotland is a precursor, of course, to rejoining after a successful independence referendum. The UK has passed the Internal Market Act, which basically means that English rules, the Scots and the Welsh cannot ban goods meeting English rules from their jurisdictions. There's huge potential there for political rows because the Scots and Welsh point out that the Internal Market Act gives them less freedom, fewer exceptions than they had from single market rules. There's risk to trade with the EU. Peter mentioned these mechanisms and things. One of the areas the government has said it's really interested in looking at again is GDPR. A lot of people don't like GDPR, think it's far too burdensome on small businesses, but GDPR reform puts at risk a very important decision that the UK has got out of the EU since the TCA was signed, that data adequacy decision. So there are battles there. And there's burdens on UK businesses if you have to comply with two regimes, or maybe actually you'll just comply with the EU regime. And the capacity in UK regulators. We've had to take on lots of new responsibilities, but actually lots of our regulators are suffering losses of income because they can no longer sell licenses to do business in the EU. So that's a real pressure point. We've seen reports on that about the medicines regulator. So we've looked at the battle lines with the EU, but I think you might want to think too about where are the battle lines within the UK Parliament as the government brings forward its agenda to make the most of what it calls Brexit opportunities. There's some guarantees in the TCA against regression, so going backwards, but there are other areas where the government may be tempted to move. You will remember that as we debated the withdrawal agreement, there was a lot of debate about whether the final agreement should protect, say, no regression on things like workers' rights or put in safeguards there. Government very reluctant to accept those sorts of constraints on its action, but perhaps the government's new coalition of voters may prove more effective. So those are some battlegrounds to come. So one final message, the more we have diverged from EU regulations by the time another government takes over, the bigger the shock of moving back into alignment. So if you like, it's a game where you're moving apart. We started off together, relatively easy to align if we'd agreed that in the TCA, but over time that will become potentially harder and harder.
Thank you so much. That was so comprehensive on every segment. You are truly expertise. But I mean, it does just show, you know, again, the economic effects of Brexit are really multi-scalar, right, and multi-dimensional. And I think that those were covered in great detail. So what we'll do, again, please post your questions in the chat to the viewers. We'll move on to Professor Jonathan Portis next. But then at the end, I'm going to bring back in Christopher Gray to talk about his book, Unfolding a Brexit, just to bring back his 4 points as just to kind of recompense for the slight technical delay at the start. So we'll turn over now to Professor Jonathan Portis, who is a fellow at the UK and Changing Europe Centre at King's College London, with a long-standing career in the civil service, but also a regular writer and commentator on economic issues in the UK. Over to you. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Johnna. I will try to be relatively brief to give time for Chris to come back. And I think I probably won't actually use these slides, but rather try and be a bit more focused, because they probably try and cover too much, as always is the temptation. But I did want to start by trying to introduce a little bit of controversy by disagreeing with, to some extent, with what Patrick said at the beginning. This idea that we are seeing the impacts of Brexit coming through now, and that is responsible for all or most of our current economic ills. That really just isn't the case. What are we seeing? What is the current state of the British economy? We had the labour market figures yesterday and the inflation figures today, and together they give us a pretty good picture of where we are. We have remarkably low unemployment given the last 18 months, very high level of job vacancies. We have wages rising quite high in nominal, quite strongly in nominal terms. A lot of that is a bounce back after the pandemic, but there are also some quite significant nominal wage rises going on, particularly for people who are switching jobs or in particular shortage educations. We have energy prices going up a lot. And then today we had the inflation figures, which showed inflation going up quite a lot. Inflation now over 4% and headed higher, driven by transport and energy prices among other things. But the key thing here is to note that these impacts are really not primarily driven by Brexit. They just aren't. Why do we know that? Well, it's pretty simple. It's because you can observe broadly the same trends in inflation in particular, and hence in real wages in both the US and the Eurozone. There is no obvious Brexit-induced divergence between the UK, the US, and the Eurozone on what's happening to wages and real wages, what's happening to energy prices and inflation. So I think it's quite important not to get drawn into this reflex of blaming Brexit for everything that's happening. That's just not what's going on. Even in the labour market, while there clearly are some Brexit-induced supply shortages, HGV drivers is partly, but not all, due to Brexit. There are some other subsectors, abattoirs, of course, we know about, where there are Brexit-induced effects. That is not really the big picture for the whole economy. In accommodation and food services, Patrick mentioned restaurants. Actually, wages in accommodation and food services are slightly below where they were before the pandemic. All this headlines about chefs getting 20 or 30% pay increases. Well, maybe it's true for some chefs, but it is not happening across the board. The number of people working in those sectors is still down below what it was before so Brexit has something to do with it, but it's not the main driver. Where do we actually see the impact of Brexit? I think it is clear that the UK's relatively poor export performance, which Peter has written about, is at least in part down to Brexit. But even there, we see some quite puzzling things going on. Britain's export performance is dreadful over the last few years compared to pre-pandemic, but it's dreadful, equally dreadful to export destinations outside the EU as well as inside the EU. And while I'm certainly convinced that there are Brexit impacts going on there, I very much welcome Peter's view, actually, about what's really going on. Why are our exports to non-EU countries performing so much worse than Eurozone exports to outside the EU? It probably does have quite a bit to do with Brexit, but I suspect the linkage is, but it's clearly not just the TCA, or at least not the direct, obvious impacts of the TCA, which are doing that. And clearly, if you want a strategy to reboot and restart the British economy, exports both within the EU, but also to outside the EU. And of course, the government is quite right on this. A majority of our exports already go outside the EU, and most of the growth in future years will be to non-EU destinations. What is going on there? What are the what is the strategy that is designed to reverse that? That takes me on to Brexit and how we should think about our, whatever that means, a progressive approach, if you're from the Progressive Economy Forum, say, our approach to economic strategy for the UK in a after Brexit. What is the strategy? And here I'd like to highlight some sort of some things which I think are constant and some things which I think are strategic crises. The first and most obvious one is that, as anti-Brexit commentators frequently said in the run-up to the referendum and in the interregnum, the UK's fundamental structural economic problems were not caused by the EU or not going to be solved by Brexit. But that does hold equally well in converse, in the sense that Brexit will not necessarily, does not necessarily make the task of solving those problems and necessarily, it may do to some respects, any more difficult because they were difficult already. But that's why we haven't solved them. And those problems, I think, are known to us all. Low and stagnant productivity. We've had now 10 years of very, very low productivity growth, both by historical standards and compared to our major competitors. That is not the fault of Brexit, because it happened well before Brexit was a realistic possibility. Will Brexit make dealing with it more difficult? Quite possibly. Will it make dealing with it easier in some respects, as Jill, for example, has noted in some respects? It may do, but it doesn't change the fact that that is the sort of the problem, as opposed to the specific question of what do we do about Brexit. Second, inequality, both regional and sectoral, and poverty and disadvantage. What are we going to do about that? Again, Brexit's not the problem here. It may or may not make it harder or more difficult to deal with, but strategies to deal with leveling up in a meaningful rather than Johnsonian sense. That is, strategies designed to ensure that we raise the quality of jobs, particularly for those of us who don't work in high productivity service sectors like the education sector or the financial services sector. What do you do about raising the quality of jobs and the productivity of people employed in people who aren't working in those jobs? Remains the sort of fundamental challenge for any UK economic strategy. And finally, Jill promised that I would talk about immigration. So I will talk about immigration briefly, because this is one area where I think, first of all, Brexit does genuinely change the feasible policy space quite radically in a way which it doesn't for as many people have said already. It doesn't in many others. We do have really changed policy an awful lot after Brexit. Now, you can argue we could have done a lot of that within the EU, but it's not unreasonable to say that much of it would not have been feasible politically or administratively inside the EU. And in many respects, the new system is the sort of system in some, for people moving here for work, which is a lot considerably more liberal and less restrictionist than was threatened at one point, particularly under Theresa May. It is a system under which actually about half the UK labour market is in principle open to workers from abroad. In other words, if you're an employer, can you apply for a visa for somebody from outside the UK to do that job? Well, that is true for about half of all jobs. That is pretty liberal. It's considerably more liberal than the vast majority of EU countries. In other words, you want to come here from India or Canada or wherever, you are the barriers to doing so in terms of administrative and bureaucratic qualifications are considerably less than they are for most other countries, Germany, France, or Italy. So that potentially is a big opportunity for the UK, which has always benefited from migration from outside as well as inside the EU. And that in turn gives a big strategic question, this is the sort of fundamental strategic question, it seems to me, that those who want a closer relationship with the EU have to, whether it's rejoin or rejoining the single market or the customs union or whatever, you have to decide whether you are willing to reverse that and to return to some form of freedom of movement. Because leaving aside the detail, that's a sort of fundamental strategic choice. You either say, we're not going to reverse the abolition of freedom of movement with the EU, in which case we are going to remain outside the single market. We are going to remain outside the EEA. We are still going to fundamentally be in the position of trying to make incremental improvements in the existing TCA. Or on the other hand, you say, no, actually, the sensible long-term strategy for the UK is to try to, over time, to at the very least, to rejoin or reintegrate ourselves into the single market. So that is, there's lots of detail, but that still seems to me to be a fundamental strategic choice. My view, for what it's worth, is that the former is the one that's politically realistic, and the second one is not politically realistic in the foreseeable future. But of course, what do I know? I'm just an economist. I could be completely wrong about that. So I'll stop there.
It's my turn to unmute myself. Thank you so much. Well, of course, we should not disparage the economist's point of view. I think they of course, gave their prognostications of Brexit very clearly from the beginning. And I think perhaps that was the time that it should have been sort of taken a little bit more seriously. And now I think it is. So then we'll turn over for 5 more minutes for Professor Gray to come back in and talk about his latest book, The Unfolding of Brexit, for those of you who missed it, because it was a great rousing start to our discussion, and I think it will be a great way to bring it all together. So over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks. I won't take 5 minutes at all. But what I would just like, if I could just ask to have my 3rd slide back, if that's okay. Yeah, so this is all I will talk about, just to indicate that what I tried to suggest more as a kind of scene setting exercise was this idea that despite the fact that some people may have thought that both either that leaving the EU was the end of things, or at least at the end of the transition period was the end of things, that was never going to be true. I mean, it was always going to be the case that it was the beginning of a new phase, and secondly, that the Northern Ireland situation was inevitably going to give rise to future problems and future disputes. And I don't think, by the way, that it's not at all clear that these are going to be resolved, in one go. Even if there is an agreement in this present set of talks, I think that we can anticipate ongoing kind of tensions, certainly around that. For a long time. The third thought was to do with the almost a kind of structural, philosophical almost sort of problem, partly psychological problem with the nature of Brexit, that any actual form of it can be seen as being a kind of betrayal. But then the fourth thing, and I think this does speak to all the things that have been said since I spoke, is that you can't get around the fact of the fact that the European Union is there and it's right next door geographically to the United Kingdom, and so that in itself also makes it inevitable that there's going to be whatever form it takes, that there's going to be an ongoing dialogue and development about what that relationship is. And I think the only thing that I would sort of add, having listened to what has been said this evening, is there's very much a problem of the tension between those latter two points, because it seems to me that we're still, if one were to sort of follow the very kind of sensible suggestions, for example, that Peter Holmes made in his presentation, as soon as you were to do that, you would run into the fact that Brexit is still enormously toxic, and you would immediately run into the fact of people saying it would be almost impossible, I think, for a Johnson government to do it, and it's very difficult to imagine the next leader of the Conservative Party, whoever it is, being someone who would really take on that agenda. And Labour are going to struggle with that agenda, because as soon as you start, I think the best hope for Labour is to actually just make it just an incredibly boring, technocratic exercise in terms of doing all kinds of things, because who really knows or understands about sen and sen-elect? I doubt whether one person in a million has even kind of heard of these things, right? And so that would seem to me to be the recently I think Keir Starmer talked in terms of making Brexit work, or I think, or perhaps you could talk about it in terms of doing Brexit better, or even, in a sense, almost not framing it as being about Brexit at all, because as I try to indicate, that's a kind of a dead question, and to normalise it as a kind of if you want to call it, a certain kind of foreign policy question about how the UK relates to the European Union, and then, as I say, within that, to make it, I think this is sort of the most hopeful scenario, is to make it a set of very boring and incremental kinds of steps that make sense in themselves and are perhaps relatively contentious. Now, clearly that couldn't apply to the point that Jonathan was making about freedom of movement. I don't think there's any way that you can that you could finesse that. But I think that some of those other kinds of things that Peter was talking about are potentially more achievable. And he makes the key point that in any case, the fact of the TCA review makes it necessary, makes it inevitable that there will be an engagement of some sort with that agreement. So thanks for having me back to but maybe that also serves as a certain kind of wrap up as well.
No, absolutely, like a discussant sort of, bringing it all together. No, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, of course, so what I've done is I've brought together the questions. Some have put in the chat, but also I gathered through text and various sources. So what I have is two broad-based questions. One question about what's missing, and then I'll direct kind of specific technical questions to you each. So we can do it. So I'll start with our two kind of broad brush questions for all panelists to reflect on and answer if you want. So the first question that actually came up a couple of times is sort of about the realistic kind of implicit return to the way things were framing, right? Can we ever return? So if we understand basically that the best trade terms that are available are those that are in the customs union, then any attempt to improve trade terms must therefore be some attempt to re-enter. And this trap, so whether it's Labour's trap and the role that opposition will play, or as a strategy of permanent negotiation, as Peter outlined. So, it's effectively a trap. If we understand that the best terms are in the customs union, how do we ever try to improve terms without somehow just trying to re-enter through the back door? So that was a sort of general question that was phrased differently across the presentation. The other one is about disaggregating or differentiating the effects between Brexit and COVID. If ultimately what we're saying is that there is some sort of economic shock, Brexit would suggest it's endogenous and COVID that it's exogenous, but they're simultaneous. And can we ever disaggregate them, or is it sort of this great chance of luck that nobody will ever be, you can't ever make anyone accountable for Brexit because there's this muddying of the waters with COVID. So those are the two kind of general questions that came up. And the question about what was missing comes from our fellow PEF panelist, Stephanie Griffith-Jones, which is really about the City of London and Canary Wharf and the exclusion of financial services from the TCA. And she asks about the risks, the financial risks the crisis, and if anybody has, or risks and systemic crisis, and if anybody has any preliminary thoughts. It seems I did notice, as with the TCA, the very large size 1 square mile and Canary Wharf size holes missing in the discussion. So is there any preliminary thoughts on that? So we'll take it as a round, and then if that's okay, if you want to offer your reflections, and then I'll ask the directed questions. Do any of the panelists want to come in on the more general points, thematic questions about, re-entering? Do we just end up in a re-entering strategy, or does COVID make it impossible to really account for what the effect of Brexit is?
I'll pick up on the second one, which is, does COVID make it impossible? No, I don't think so. I mean, I really think, of course, there's lots of very sophisticated econometrics that is required here, but it is very simple. If you look at a graph of inflation in the US, UK, and the Eurozone, it is pretty simple just to look at it and say, well, Brexit is not what caused the sharp rise in prices. It may have had some impact on the margins. You can't rule that out from looking at the graph, but you can look at the graph and say, look, Brexit is not the main thing that's going on here. Equally, you can look at the graph of exports and see our notable underperformance since about the beginning of 2020, before even the pandemic, and say, well, this it almost certainly is not COVID related, because it is underperformance with respect to all of our major competitors. Brexit is almost certainly a significant contributor, possibly not the only one. There may be other things going on, but I think it is pretty difficult to look at the data and say that Brexit has not hurt our exports. So there will be loads and loads and loads of papers that use sophisticated techniques to address both of those questions. But I do absolutely believe that it is possible that even now we can make some sort of conclusions about what's going on now and the extent to which it's driven by Brexit and COVID.
Excellent. No, and of course, Jill has posted a link to a paper. Peter, did you want to come in?
Thanks. Yes, just to pick up on one point about separating out the effects, and Jonathan sort of threw at me, could I explain why the export performance to the rest of the world has been so bad? All I can say is that the last meeting with my colleagues who did the work on these trade data, which I've not been directly involved in it, there remains a lot of mystery to actually, they use all kinds of sophisticated techniques to simulate a world without Brexit, and you get a lot of anomalies in these numbers. It's very difficult to sort it out. But I would just like to perhaps respond directly to Johnna's point about, given that the best possible trading relationship is one inside the EU, how do we set about trying to get to it without admitting that Brexit was a mistake? I think that, and there's a question raised by Chris Hall, perhaps I might comment on. I think it's not impossible to actually acknowledge that Brexit hasn't delivered the benefits that everybody thought. And, we need to remind ourselves that, it isn't the case that, you bought it, you own it quite in the same way as it might be. We can in fact renegotiate. It is possible. We can't join the EU customs union if we're not a member of the EU. That's clear. And this is where we get to the tedious things about the difference in a customs union and the customs union. Turkey has a form of customs union with the EU. It would not be impossible for a British government to negotiate a better arrangement on customs than we have at the moment. We'd actually tariffs are pretty low generally, and losing the ability to set our tariffs against third countries is not actually a huge loss. The problem comes with regulations, and Sen and Senelec are interesting. Most people don't know about them, and perhaps, as Chris says, we should try and keep them quiet. But they are the big European standards bodies, and in the single market debate way back when, people were worried about accepting majority voting on standards. We've accepted that. So things which seem difficult to envisage in the sort of toxic Brexit environment might actually be feasible. I mean, opinion polls recently seem to have suggested that people's concern about migration is less than it might otherwise have, than it once was. But clearly there are all kinds of trade-offs. So it's not impossible to imagine that one could have pragmatic small steps in a direction of alignment without and say, look, we can do all of these things without committing ourselves to rejoining. I mean, rejoining is something which, according to opinion polls, and I'm certainly not a political scientist, but opinion polls suggest that if offered the choice, people would actually vote for it. That's not to say you want to go and embrace it yet, but it implies it might not be as politically damaging as you might have feared.
Or was.
Can I come in and throw a bucket of cold water over what Peter's just been saying? And we have to remember there are two parties to this agreement. There is the UK and the EU. I think the EU, from a sort of narrow mercantilist point of view, rather than an EU consumer point of view, did a very good deal for the EU. They got access to the UK market for their goods. They managed to shut out, and now, why is there no equivalence decision? There's no reason not to give the UK an equivalence decision on merits. We've got less access than the US or Singapore to the EU market. Is there any reason for that? No, there's one reason for that. It enables EU countries to grab a share of that very lucrative UK services business. And we've seen a process of relocations there. Why on earth would the EU, even if the UK moved to a position where 58% of people wanted to rejoin and 42% of people didn't, would you put yourself through the agony of bringing the UK back in? Maybe if it was moving into the sort of high 90s or something like that, but the UK has basically destabilized and derailed the EU over the past 4 or 5 years. I don't see, we know that it would have to be unanimity to allow accession. So I would have thought that the prospects that the EU is rushing to do that. There may be some scope for a government that is less concerned than this government is about jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. There may be scope for some of these side deals on alignment. Even Edwin Poots, the Northern Ireland Agriculture Minister, was suggesting a deal on sanitary and phytosanitary standards in order to make the Northern Ireland Protocol function better. And that's clearly on offer. Maros Sefcovic has repeatedly said that if the UK wants it, that's on offer, provided the UK accepts the terms, which are alignment and oversight. So for a government for whom these issues aren't as sort of important as they are for this government, that may be a possibility. Or if the debate has moved on and people have a much more pragmatic view. But I think that the politics of rejoining are quite a long way off, because I think you have to remember, what on earth would the EU want to do inviting the giant ugly cuckoo back in its nest, only to have another thing disrupt it all again?
Yes, it's the EU's, exactly, the pressures within the EU to consider in that as well. No, I think that's an excellent point. Okay, so we'll move to the individual questions. Let me start with Chris Gray. The question was to pull up on the political psychology of betrayal and the idea that there's also the political psychology of aggrievement, and that these can be found in equal measure on the Remain and the Leave side. And how do you see these sort of polls, these sort of political, this sort of political psychology playing out in Brexit unfolding? of both betrayal and aggrievement that they can have on either side. Yeah.
Sorry, the second word was aggrievement, was it?
Yeah, aggrievement. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting because I thought that the second word was bereavement.
Oh,
Which
it could be that works as well. Yeah.
I mean, what I would say about that is that, I mean, it seems to me. By the way, this is the inverse point to what Jill just made, which I also completely agree with, which is that there's no way from an EU point of view that unless there's a really massive and sustained consensus in the UK over, I would say over a long period, that it could conceivably make sense. But now to come back to the question, the other side of that coin is that we are really in a very serious situation, I would say, kind of socially, about the fact that the idea of Brexit was never proposed to be, oh, this will be a permanently divided nation. And I think that, because of all reasons that we could rehearse and we kind of know about, to have created a situation where effectively half, maybe slightly more than half of the kind of population now, are more or less just being sort of told, okay, there's nothing for you anymore. To try to think that we can think in terms of Brexit in terms of kind of governmental strategies and national strategies and national interests, but how can we sustain a society and a culture in which one half of the population has been so dismissively kind of, now you could say, well, if there'd been a narrow victory to stay in the EU, wouldn't have that been the same for people who are on the leave side? But it wouldn't have been, because of the fact that, well, I think anyway, there's a fundamental difference between the proposition which would be to do with continuing as you were, because you don't actually have to do anything, as opposed to making that transformation. And particularly because of a lot of the people who were, at least we would say probably, in terms of the statistics of the demographics of the vote, that a lot of the people who have had to take responsibility for delivering Brexit are precisely those people who think that it actually isn't a very good idea, or even a terrible idea as well. And so it seems to me that the most obvious kind of polarizations it's created that will have political impact are in relation particularly to Scotland and Northern Ireland in a different way, but Scotland. But we shouldn't also forget that we have effectively created what looks like to be a permanently kind of divided society, and one in which it becomes even ever more clearer that Brexit was kind of both a trigger for and a symbol of and an intensification of a much more profound kind of set of cleavages between generations, between regions and cities, and all those kinds of things. So there's we can talk about the issues about joining or not rejoining the EU, but there's an enormous task to be done in terms of remaking both the United Kingdom and actually England as well.
Yes, I think that's exactly the kind of key point that actually transitions your answer to the question for Jonathan Portis about leveling up and the idea of regional inequalities, because we have, talked about the kind of different regional impacts within the UK of Brexit. So the question, there was two questions for Jonathan. One was about the leveling up agenda, and is it possible without freedom of movement? And I think that sort of brings again the point about regional inequality. And how do you have regional inequality if you don't, if there is, what's the effect of freedom of movement, but also the investment in public services, so the effect on the care and health services as well. So as a kind of fragmented effect that makes leveling up, the leveling up agenda more difficult. And where was the other one? Okay, I think I'll leave that one for you, John.
I mean, I think, leveling up is fundamentally about domestic policy choices. Brexit may make it more difficult or perhaps easier in some respects around the margin, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the very difficult set of policy choices that you have. Leveling up, in my view, requires a sort of pretty sustained program of investment to improve both physical and digital connectivity. and it requires a sustained program of investment in education and skills targeted on those people who are most disadvantaged or most lack opportunities under the current system. Neither of those is fundamentally relies on freedom of movement. Of course, Brexit may reduce tax revenues, which makes this more difficult on the margin. But frankly, leveling up should not, Brexit should not be either a main component of the leveling up agenda or an obstacle to it. In terms of migration, again, there is nothing stopping the government with the new system seeking to promote migration for particular sectors and regions. It hasn't chosen to very much yet, but that's and I think there are significant risks, in particular, the fact that you have a salary threshold as the main criterion for entry under the new points-based system may make it even more the case that London is the most attractive destination for relatively skilled migrants, which clearly does not promote any leveling up agenda. That's certainly a risk, but again, that's not something the government is obliged to do. It could quite easily change that. I've said, and I've advised both the Welsh and Scottish governments accordingly, that the government's liberalisation of migration policy towards the Hong Kong Chinese citizens with British national overseas passports is potentially a huge opportunity for areas outside London, if they can convince people from Hong Kong that those are the places that those places are where they want to go and live and want to settle. That's potentially a big boost. That's not, there was nothing stopping us doing what we did there before Brexit, but nonetheless, if you see that as part of a attempt, at least, of the global Britain agenda, there are some clear opportunities here. So I don't think it's, leveling up sort of intersects with Brexit, but Brexit certainly doesn't make leveling up impossible. That's the question of having a decent long-term set of policies and strategies. Now, you can perfectly well argue that the government entirely lacks those at the moment, but I don't think it's Brexit on its own which is driving that.
Okay, thank you. And okay, I think the question I missed was from James Meadway, the director of PEF, about the TCA. I missed that. Apologies, James. And just for you to comment on, much of the discussion was about that the TCA seems fragile. And in your sense, from your sort of macroeconomic analysis, what do you see as the kind of fragilities within the TCA agreement? He asked, what will survive 2025? It was how he framed it, but I think just the fragilities.
Well, I mean, I think, in some sense, from a big picture point of view, the big decision was when we decided collectively, or the government decided, and no one was able or willing to overturn that view, that free movement had to end and that we were going to leave the single market and customs union. That was the really big call. And once you've gone down that road, then you were inevitably left with a TCA, which is little more than a free trade agreement with some bells and whistles on the end. Now, and that's where we are. We have a hard Brexit, not a no deal or a WTO Brexit, but a hard Brexit. Now, I think there is then a question of whether, is that the TCA we have, is it fundamentally unstable? And I have sort of argued that in the past that, you either have to move to managed reconvergence or you will move to, to progressively greater divergence. And I think there is something in that it is inherently unstable, that as Peter rightly said, and both Peter and Chris in different ways from a trade policy and from a sort of broader political point of view, that, Brexit is a never ending, Brexit never ends. It's an ongoing process. The current position is inherently unstable. So either we're going to have some form of managed reconvergence, or more likely, given the current government and the current political situation, we're going to have further divergence. And I think that probably is the most likely scenario. That in turn might learn, so I think, managed further divergence is the most likely scenario, unless, of course, the whole thing crashes and burns as a result of Northern Ireland, which, it's not an economic question, but fundamentally a political one.
Well, if you ask Michel Barnier, he would say that the TCA is a framework for managing divergence. That was, once the UK made those decisions, they didn't want an off-the-shelf institutional model. That was what he always said the objective was. So I think the big question is, do both sides want to make this thing work, or do they want to light on everything that you could and blow it into a giant flare-up, which is what we've seen over some of the sort of things about, let's take Northern Ireland out of it. There are obviously big issues there, but the French fishing licenses, are we going to blow everything into sort of obstruction at dawn and things like that? And if both sides want to make it work, and the EU accepts that actually it's put pretty big barriers up against UK businesses wanting to get into the EU, those non-tariff barriers are hugely significant, then actually it can be relatively relaxed about the extent of divergence and leave it to domestic politics to say it can accept that the UK is doing a bit differently. There might even be some areas where it's quite interesting to see what the UK does. And just as we did with the speedy approval of vaccines, or let us experiment on the British population and then they can see what they want to copy. So I don't think, but I think it depends on goodwill on both sides. But on the levelling up thing, I think we need to remember, Brexit ultimately, I think, is political rather than economic. That was Remain's mistake to think it was an economic decision. And you could say that the decision to proceed with Brexit against the sort of view of the metropolitan elite was actually a big political levelling up, in the sense of doing an agenda that was not an agenda of comfy Remainers sitting in London. Actually did speak to a whole bunch of people who felt that British politics hadn't offered anything very much to them over rather a long period.
No, I think that's a good point. And it does segue to one of the questions for you, Jill, which is about how realistic is it that the UK can be a kind of leader in any sector post-Brexit? So if you could give some sort of indication on these sort of, you spoke about the battle lines in Parliament, but also there's this kind of scrapping of industrial policy. I mean, in the Brexit period, there was this kind of, we're going to have an industrial policy. Again, that's levelling up was wrapped up in that. And that was, as soon as we left, it was scrapped. So how do we go about kind of being leaders in the industry? And then, as suggested, I'll just read out Stephanie's question to you, which is that you didn't mention financial deregulation, which many thought was a waste of the motivations for Brexit. Will it be very damaging for financial stability and risk of the future?
Okay, well, I didn't mention financial deregulation because actually I don't know huge amounts about it, but there is a report by our colleague Sarah Hall coming out in the next few weeks on services, and Sarah does know about financial services. I think, it's going to be a bit niche where the UK might lead and might then persuade the EU to follow. But I think there'll be some areas where the EU may be looking at what the UK does to see what works, or other places. I mean, there's scope for cooperating with other regulators beyond the EU in some areas, but I don't think anything is going to be giant-sized. On the financial services, it's quite interesting. One thing that people thought the Chancellor might do was bin the limit on bankers' bonuses, which I think we had as EU policy, but he didn't do that because I think they thought that wasn't great political optics and I think you have to come back to the domestic politics. It is possible, having not got an equivalence decision, the Chancellor will go down that. Obviously, the city was very divided. Some hedge funds, private equity were very keen to get out of EU, what they thought were very constraining EU regulations. Other big asset firms and things like that were very keen to have very good access maintained. So I think we may see bits of deregulation, but I don't think it's going to be absolutely one way. But the UK has always been quite a big player on finance. We've always been quite a big player in the Bank for International Settlements. Quite a lot of the EU regulatory framework actually comes from that sort of wider regulatory framework where we will continue to be quite a big player. And it's quite interesting that we're looking to hook up with the Swiss, who are having their own problems with the EU, partly as part of a sort of rather unfortunate triangle between the EU, the UK, and the Swiss. So it's quite interesting that we're trying to look at regulatory cooperation there to see if we can encircle the EU. So it's very interesting if you read the Chancellor's statement last year on the UK's new equivalence regime, you could read it as an implicit criticism of everything about the way the EU makes decisions. I mean, lots of emphasis on transparency, collaboration, stability, as opposed to the EU, we will take an opaque decision and we can tear it up at any minute. So, so there's some quite interesting thinking going on in the Treasury. Problem is, I think the Treasury just doesn't really focus on Brexit very much. It's sort of, decided that COVID is the bigger game in town and keeping its head below the parapet, which I think needs to stop.
Interesting. So do you think it's like a division of labor, that the Treasury is focused on COVID and maybe business innovation?
Well, I'd be very interested what Chris and Peter think, but it looks to me as though at the moment Brexit policy is a wholly owned subsidiary of David Frost and Boris Johnson, and that it's not. I mean, we know that the trade policy for Brexit is not being run out of the Department for International Trade, which is quite weird. And David Frost has his two bits. He has his Europe Directorate, seems to be taking over managing relations with Europe from the Foreign Office, and being the dominant force on that, but also has his second Directorate General about the Brexit opportunities, so the post-Brexit regulatory agenda, future trade, where do we go to be able to demonstrate a Brexit dividend. So, and that Frost-Johnson nexus seems to be dictating policy at the moment, but these things can always change.
Yeah, that's true. Exactly. People come and go. So the last, but of course, not least, is Peter Holmes. Of course, I invite you to comment on the question about where exactly are the levers of government concerned about Brexit, as we can't quite discern them ourselves. But the question for you was similarly along these lines about designing, are we effectively having a trade policy that's making it harder and harder, which I think we've discussed at length. But one question that struck me was about the opportunities that are presented from sort of permanent negotiation. What I understand is that, rules-based policy, and maybe this is also the transformation that's happening in the Treasury, or the critique of Europe, is this kind of rules-based model, and that permanent negotiation is opening up opportunities, but like free ports was the example that you gave, and now is your chance to enlighten us all on how free ports are a way of solving Brexit or problems caused by Brexit. But doesn't that also like overlook the costs that are kind of incurred throughout the supply chain? So there's these questions about transnational companies relocating in the UK, trying to split the border. Will they have a headquarters or parts of their supply chain in the UK to access consumers? But the free ports is one element of that. The larger question is, though, isn't permanent negotiation just opening up more costs to be incurred along the supply chain for all those different trading relationships?
Oh, very easy question there. First, free ports, I think there's a general consensus among everybody who's looked at the experience of other countries that they work when you're dealing with a highly protectionist, very badly over-regulated country, and you want to deregulate and you want to find out how to do so. So you do it bit by piecemeal in a particular area first. But we've got very low tariffs. We've got a reasonably sort of flexible bureaucracy. With free ports can't actually bring us anything. If you look at the amount of money that's being spent, it'll just about pay for the barbed wire around the bonded warehouses. But free ports aren't sort of new big zones where things are going to change a lot. They're literally a handful of bonded warehouses. They can't have much effect at all. And it's really rather striking. That's the one element the government stresses about how freedom, which we could have sent them up before, is going to be used to level up. I mean, it's a bit depressing on that. As far as the constant renegotiation, I think I completely agree that it's very hard to persuade the EU to renegotiate things with us. But the question is, what should we be asking for? And the way I see the permanent renegotiation thing is we're in a mess over Brexit, and the kind of issues like the SPS arrangements. I mean, our present situation is a high degree of uncertainty, for everybody. One of the essences of the EU has been to make rules predictable. In Britain at the moment, no one really knows what the rules are going to be in 6 months' time. Will they be changed? So I think the purpose of the ongoing negotiations, which we are going to have, would be to have some clarity, even if it's the UK agreeing to align itself in certain areas for 5 years at a time. That will give people some knowledge about what's going to happen, what the rules are going to be. But nobody really knows what kind of documentation is going to be needed on the UKCA. Actually, this isn't quite the same thing as Sen and Sen-elect, but it's highly related. What kind of certification rules are we going to have? We can do what we like, but that's not necessarily good for business. So I think the negotiations are going to should be about predictability as well as smoothness.
Excellent. Well, I think I would love to go one more round, but I realize we're only signed up till 6:30, because we do have more questions, of course, from people in the audience. But there is only left now for me is to thank everyone for your time, for your thoughtful and generous comments and reflections, and as well for everybody who came and everyone who was diligent enough to email and text and send tweets to say, give us the link, because I really like the idea you were sort of banging down the door to get in. So thank you for everyone who came. Yeah, we're only left now to thank you all, as we do normally, with a kind of round of applause. And Patrick, do you have any concluding remarks before we let everyone go?
Yes, very briefly. Thank you very much, Johnna, for being such a great chair, and for our distinguished speakers. It's a fascinating debate, and I think I take Chris's point that I think the aim going forward is to make trade really technical and boring again, which it always used to be, I think. It's when everybody was required to have a view about trade, we got into a lot of trouble. So it's probably movement by subterfuge going forwards. So anyway, we will put a film up on our website of the debate for those who missed the beginning or those who missed it altogether. And going forwards, we are going to publish a paper from Peter Holmes in the new year, which will be a more detailed look at some of these issues. So watch out for that. And then in the new year, we're hoping to have a webinar with Robert Skidelsky and Guy Standing about basic income and job guarantees. So that should be good. And finally, don't forget to buy our book, The Return of the State, which we published this year. It's a perfect Christmas present for your friends and your family. So with that, thank you very much, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, goodbye.